Hey there, Stanford fans. Welcome to the Bootleg Stanford postgame report. I'm RJ Abeytia alongside Jim Rutter, where a homecoming crowd was treated well with a 38-14 win by the Cardinal. Again, the home cooking. Again, it worked. Again, the Stanford offense looked a lot better than it had the week before.
Well, and RJ, we're back to a winning formula, right? Scoring some points on our side and not allowing them to score much usually tends to be in our favor. So everybody's happy today. There was home cooking. Homecoming crowd's happy. We didn't get bad weather. We didn't have any rush of turnovers. A couple early picks by Kevin Hogan before he settled down. But that was in the first quarter when we were already establishing that this was going to be a long afternoon for the Beavers.
Well, yeah, and I think Stanford just kind of skipped over the red zone issue for a week by just scoring from well beyond the red zone, and certainly that's something that fans like to watch.
The ticket? We just want to, everything.
Let's just not bother.
From 40 or 50 yards out. No, big plays, the return of the big play today, right? We saw some dynamic play. We've got half of the McCaffrey equation already solved now. We want to see McCaffrey early and often. At least today, we saw him early.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that there were touchdowns from many, many different places, many different sources. This is what I think we hoped the Stanford offense would look like on a more regular basis. And the question becomes, how much of this can we take moving forward to what is essentially the final exam for the Stanford football team next week?
Well, I got a sense that productivity from the offense goes a long way in helping the defense maintain its focus and intensity. And you saw the result there was that Oregon State didn't get past positive rushing yardage for very long. It was sort of back and forth with the sack yardage totals. Tough for them to get anything going on the ground. It was only a couple of late plays that even got them up into the 200-yard range. So if Stanford's going to hold a team to, let's call it a touchdown. Really should have just been one touchdown and under 200 yards. You're going to win most of those games. So that part we know.
Well, yeah, and the fact that Stanford was playing from downhill and they were doing it early. I mean, they jumped out. They had a 21-7 lead. It was 28-7 at the half, and I think the feel in the stadium was pretty much that the contest had been decided at that point.
Well, I think you can make some early assumptions on how games are going. Stanford is not a team that's going to do well coming back from an early deficit, just as other teams are going to have a heck of a time coming back. Once the Cardinals start scoring over 28 points, it's pretty much over. I mean, you look at what happened last night with Cal and Oregon putting points on a minute-by-minute basis. This team, when Stanford had a 31-point lead in the fourth quarter, that was not going to change. This team has gone 3 years without giving up 30 points in an entire game. So it was over for all intents and purposes. But in fairness, this Oregon State team, I didn't see the threats, right? We didn't see the kind of threat we're used to seeing from Oregon State. There was no Marcus Wheaton. There was no Crooks. The big play threats just weren't there. And against this defense, if you can't make something happen big, you're not going to have it happen on a series-by-series basis.
Yeah, and I think, as Stanford fans, we focus so much on Stanford, and it was interesting to me today to watch Sean Mannion, a player who had a 70% completion rate last year and was a very, very highly touted player. He looked like he was struggling in much the same way that we've seen Kevin Hogan struggle.
Well, and let's face it, a lot of his yardage today came from, 3rd and 18 where he picked up 12. That's not going to hurt us. That's about the least offensive yardage you're gonna endure as a defense. So, Mannion, did he have a lot of time? No. He had people getting to him, right? We had Party in the backfield for the first time in a while now with Columbine and Looters and Henry Anderson. These guys getting into the backfield, making things happen. Luke came around the corner and got in there. So defensive pressure on a team that can't run the ball, and it's game over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it should be noted that, yes, Oregon State is a struggling running team, but Stanford did spot them David Perry today.
That's true.
And so I think I'm a little encouraged by the replacements. I thought Looters was great in the middle. Henry Anderson, always doing good work.
Middle a little bit there.
He spent a little more time there and was effective. And then the freshman, absolutely.
Yeah, that's very encouraging, and you want to build up that depth. We got to see Evan Crowder come in and actually throw the ball. Nice kind of trajectory. You're not seeing that touch maybe all the time.
No.
Hogan, a different style. And I think there was PI on at least one of those plays that would have otherwise had had Evan putting up some nice yardage. But people got into the action today, right? We saw Jordan Pratt, who was doing his imitation of Curtis Conway with the cuts midfield. I don't know where that came from. We're used to seeing Pratt as primarily a possession receiver, and today he busted out the open field moves.
Yeah, no, I mean he took the angle to get to the corner, because if he hadn't planned that out well in advance, I don't think he makes it to the end zone. But nevertheless, the cuts midfield were great, and he wasn't the only player. Montgomery, McCaffrey all showed really explosive moves in the open field.
Let's call attention, give credit to McCaffrey, and obviously we've got a definite bootleg agenda and giving props to McCaffrey, but McCaffrey with a nice block that helped spring Ty Montgomery, who showed the patience to pick his way through, and with his acceleration, he can slow it down, wait for things to happen, and then explode, and that looked like almost an effortless run for him on his touchdown. But Montgomery, another drop today. We did have a few penalties, but I think it was only 3 for the whole game, right? So it wasn't bad. The mistakes were limited today. Team seemed to be back into it. Positive atmosphere on the sideline. It was all good. I mean, you win big in a Pac-12 game. There's not much to complain about.
No, and certainly if you're going to talk about drop passes, they hurt Oregon State a lot more than they hurt us. Earlier, I thought they did have a few opportunities to make some plays, and they didn't do it. And Stanford has seen what happens to you on the road when that happens. So the real question to me is, we've got Stanford's season in 2 parts. We basically have them pummeling teams that they're supposed to, and not yet able to get over the hump against a ranked team. So moving forward, what are we looking at next week? What are we thinking?
Well, we have a team that we know we don't want to try and outscore the Ducks at Autzen Stadium. It's going to have to be another one where we hold it down. But I'm not sure how you best attack this Stanford team. The hurry-up doesn't seem to be our greatest area of vulnerability. You try and use matchup difficulties. I mean, Oregon State had a big, tall receiver. They went time and again at Alex Carter on the fade in the corner to no success whatsoever. In fact, he almost picked it off not once but twice.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting, because I think Oregon as a team is starting to come into themselves, but I also think it's always a little bit different when you play that Stanford defense, especially if you're Oregon.
Yeah, the Ducks are gripping a little bit. They know that they're used to, they're going on the road and scoring 59 points. Yeah. Who does that? Who goes on the road and scores 60 points a game? Yes, they're explosive. Yes, they're dangerous. And I know every Duck fan has this little bit in the back of their mind saying, yeah, but I'm still worried about that Stanford defense, and they really should be.
Well, especially if Stanford gets a little bit of fortune and David Perry's able to come back, because I think then you've got the depth that you're going to need to stand up to that attack for 60 minutes.
Okay, so let's talk for a minute. We had a 42-yard touchdown early from McCaffrey. Showed that initial move can create opportunities. So what are we seeing something special here? Is it just the fans getting overly excited, or are these flashes of really outlier talent?
Well, to me, it's just how often he's winning one-on-one situations and winning them cleanly. In other words, I mean, we're talking about whiffs out on the field for the defensive players. Like, he's putting moves on people and then getting back to full speed. We haven't seen that very often from Stanford's playmakers.
From Stanford. I saw it last night watching the Cal game.
Absolutely.
From just about every member of the Oregon offense.
Yeah, I mean,
they all have those moves.
McCaffrey may be sticking out a little bit because of the team he's on, but nevertheless, he's making people miss. He's making plays, and I mean, I don't think there's any point I don't think at this point we question it. I mean, is he a 30 carry a game back? Certainly not, but he can be a player that impacts a game. There's no question about that.
So better execution today. Red zone wasn't perfect. I think it was 2 for 4. I thought it was a brilliant call to have Kevin fake and take the ball himself down on this end of the field. That was a terrific play. He fought through, took some contact, still made it in. I mean, he's showing he's not mailed the season in. Some of the fans have gotten on this team pretty hard because we're so used to winning.
So have some of us.
So used to cruising, and it's hard to keep that that championship mentality when you drop a game or two, but I saw nothing from Kevin Hogan saying he was mailing in, even after a couple early mistakes.
Well, and David Shaw touched upon that in his press conference. He talked about how in the last 2 seasons, there have been moments where outside the locker room, the world was crashing down, to use his terminology, and you stay with it, they stayed with it, and they've ended up in Pasadena the last 2 years. And we don't know how things are going to end up this year, but I think it's good to have a little bit of perspective that this feels like a disappointing season up until this point, but there's a lot in front of this team, and the Pac-12 championship is still within this team's control.
Right, and so the fact that Oregon is still on the schedule, I mean, we'll know a lot more after next Saturday, right?
Yeah.
This was early Halloween for Oregon State, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Well, hopefully there won't be a late one for the good guys next week. We'll see what happens. But I mean, the season, the ceiling on the season will largely be determined by next Saturday, and that's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the point in the season where if you wanted Stanford to be playing its best football, this is the time to do it. And we got some hints. Maybe Stanford's best game is ahead of it. And you know what? They've underachieved a few times this year. I don't think it's out of the question that maybe they step up and have a game where they surprise some people or overachieve based on, how they're going to be favored next week.
You hate to point out weaknesses. I'd say one thing that we're still waiting to see from this team, the defense has been lights out. Turnover creation could be better.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, we could use a break once in a while. We haven't had the pick six. We haven't had the block kick. Our special teams have largely been taken out of the equation by, let's face it, let's give some credit where credit's due, skillful game planning by our opponents who've realized,
absolutely,
we'll take the midfield possession if it means we don't have to take a look at a Montgomery or a McCaffrey returning the ball.
Well, and you talked about how the Stanford offense, when it's functioning, can energize and enable the Stanford defense, and I think that also goes for special teams. A lot of the reasons that these teams are so willing to trade field position is that they don't think Stanford's going to move the ball. If the Stanford offense is clicking, teams have to rethink that, and maybe they have to roll the dice and put the ball in Ty Montgomery's hands, put the ball in McCaffrey's hands, and I think Stanford fans would roll the dice on that anytime.
Well, certainly the Beavers did us a favor today. They did not put a lot of pressure on Kevin Hogan. They did not contain our running game particularly well. I hate to say there weren't a lot of things that the Beavers did to make this one particularly competitive. It's going to happen with matchups. It won't happen every week. We're not going to get a favorable matchup, but certainly today it was.
Yeah, but to their credit, Oregon State was one of the better pass rush teams in the country coming into this game, and Hogan has taken his shots this year, but as has the offensive line. And I think it's fair or reasonable to point out that, number one, the offensive line held up today. Hogan had plenty of time on most of his throws, and coming into this game, I don't think many Stanford fans would guess, Stanford has given up the fewest sacks and the fewest amount of runs for loss this season out of any team in the Pac-12. So certainly the bar is high here for offensive line play, but maybe a reason for some optimism moving forward.
Well, any other observations for this game that stuck out to you? I mean, we didn't see a lot of the tight ends today. There were a couple of plays, but it was mostly using those wide receivers and using a lot of them.
The wide receivers and the tight ends, I think, and having the tight ends out there on the field as legitimate threats. And no, I think at this point, it's all Oregon now. It's thoughts on Eugene. It's going back up there. And maybe the record isn't what we thought it would be, but the importance of the game is just as big as we thought it was going to be.
Are you making that road trip, RJ?
I will be there.
I will be there as well. We will see you at Autzen Stadium. For those of you who enjoy a good time game experience, our camera operator is going to lead us out here, all of 7 years old. That's the Bootleg's high-end production.
That's how we do it. The youth movement.
So until next time, from the Bootleg, that's RJ, Abeytia, and Jim Rutter, wishing you another big Cardinal win coming up.